Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pie Before Dinner. I am your host, Dr. Lou. This is Talking Math with Dr. Lou, Pie Before Dinner. I have with me in the audience a great colleague and friend, Dr. Jennifer Stimpson. I appreciate her so much. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining the program. Dr. Stinson is the Albert Einstein Congressional Fellow. Welcome, Dr. Stimpson. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so excited to be here. I'm snowed in, so it's a great place to be.
Awesome, awesome. It's a
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Okay.
Everything is fine. Let me just set. I think I'm hearing myself twice. Let
Okay.
me
Okay.
adjust that real quick. I can hear you fine. So, Dr. Simpson,
Yes.
Dr. Simpson, I have been a great fan and follower of yours since we were networked some years ago by a mutual friend of ours. It's been
Yeah.
such a pleasure to follow you and your career. You are the Albert Einstein Congressional Fellow 2021. Um, and so it just fits, right? It fits with your legacy of leadership in STEM and science and advocacy. Can you tell us a little bit about what that fellowship is and as you're working on the Hill, and tell us more about your work as an advocate, as a leader in STEM.
So I am actually one of this year's. There's 15 of us here, so I'm giving a shout out to all of my sister and brother fellow siblings. In my work, particularly on the Hill, I am working in a space where I'm offering my voice for science advocacy and looking at how my experience as a science teacher, as well as a classroom educator, can inform policy and offer an input to what we can do to improve science education for students in the nation. And with the work that we do within the congressional offices, it differs depending on where you are, but ultimately it's the same. That is to serve students so that they can have the best outcome academically and to have a better opportunity to learn science in ways that normally wouldn't have been made possible. But the idea of having federal support and then federal agencies creating curricula, creating opportunities for kids to engage is just wonderful because the future of science has already changed. And what's happening and who's leading that is the next group of science educators. And so we have a big responsibility to advocate for
Wow.
better opportunities for kids of all backgrounds.
So wow. So I mean, you've already. I mean, you've just kind of really pushed that first question. How has the future of science changed in your view?
Oh,
When you say that, how has it? I mean,
well,
I think I have a sense, but when you
right.
say that, what do you mean?
Well, I think that the future of science has changed because we have a new way of doing science. So if I can speak about what happened March 12th, 2020, I was a classroom teacher. And then not January 13th, wrong date. March 13th happened. And when March 13th happened, we all went home. We had to teach from home. And so in that space of teaching from home, we had to learn new skills and our students had to learn new skills. And so the future of science is changing because how we are teaching students. And that is what I realized in that moment, that I had to step my game up and I had to realize how to connect my students so that they could step their game up. Because one of the things about science is it is an agency course. So you can learn history online, you can actually do math. With people from a distance, but it's very hard to actually do science. How are you learning your instrumentation? How are you collecting samples and measuring those? Are you learning how to read, a graduated cylinder properly? How are you measuring out things? So this idea of instrumentation has been lost. So the agency has changed. So when you ask about how has the future of science changed, it's the idea that there needs to be something in place because science is now not just measuring out green liquid in a container. It is counting the particles that happen and counting the particles in that. And that's now data science. So there's a new way of teaching science that's necessary right now.
Yeah, listen, I'm an advocate of teaching shifts. I love how you have envisioned seeing science differently, and when we think of just March 20 and February 20 when 2020, the whole year, right?
Oh,
2020, and how the pandemics of COVID and the pandemics of racism have shifted our entire landscape, whether it's virtual,
right,
from virtual classrooming
right,
to virus control and navigation,
right,
to injustice, right?
right,
It's brought those worlds together in weird, in very weird ways. What we study, what we think about, what we teach children, you
right,
know, on people's minds. First, it was the pandemic and the onset of it, how to
right,
catch it, how
right,
contagious it was. Now we're talking. We've shifted into a space of vaccine, right?
right,
And there's so much information and misinformation about vaccines. There are issues I know here in DC around vaccine distribution. We
right.
see lots of the inequities around that here in Washington D.C.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt, I've just seen some notes on in the news around vaccine, the inequity of vaccine distribution, and yet
Right.
on the other hand, we have put this stuff in the hands of science. How do you see that? What's the role of science in these current um, distribution issues around COVID-19, around the vaccine, and around inequity?
Well, first, I have to say that I want to give a shout out to the Biden Harris administration. They have made science a cabinet level position again. So that is a great thing. So that means that there is authenticity and truth in what is happening. So, first, I have a pen that, and I don't have it on, I probably should have worn it, but it says science is real. So the idea of science is one thing, the implementation of it is something different. And so, what's important to know is science is happening, and the science of all the medicines and how the medicine came, because there's a big conversation about all of a sudden there's a vaccine, and now the vaccine, it didn't take a long time for it to come available, so now all of a sudden it works and we should trust it. So the science of the vaccine and equity has to do with how we're distributing it, and I'm not on that distribution team, but I do believe in the science of how the vaccine has been created and established. I mean, I got to give a shout out to the sister who's part of the Moderna team, Dr. Corbett, who's from North Carolina, who was part of that team, and all of the scientists who played a role in creating these the vaccines and all of the situations. But the inequity that we see, and when it comes to science, has to do with our knowledge. Far too often, people who live in under-resourced communities have science disfluency. They don't know. They get their knowledge from the grocery store. They get their knowledge from watching something online, but not really having the fluency of science. And so that goes back to what's happening in the K-12 education space. So how are we communicating what science is and what do the science programs look like in these places so that kids can have understanding of science and what science literacy is? Because when you have literacy, then you can become to have fluency. And that was something I thought about today. What is the difference between literacy and fluency? Because you can know how to read, but not be able to communicate that. And so my new goal is to make sure that people have science fluency. I spent 20 years making sure kids were science literate and knowing what science is and knowing how to communicate data and such. But fluency is just what you're talking about, is how can we communicate what's happening in a scientific space and having that critical thinking to talk in a very intellectual space.
You know, I hear something else as well in what you're saying, right? And I was just talking to a group of students today, math teachers today, around, they asked me what's missing in mathematics in terms of inequity, right? What's missing? What's standing in the way? And I said, one of the things I said was the humanity, right? We've lost the humanity of it all. I was just listening as you were talking. I was thinking about it's not just the reliance on science as the be all and end all to answer this problem, but it becomes difficult because there's humanity involved, right?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
and
Yes.
people, the disfluency you're talking about is so critical because people can, if people are disfluent in science, then it hinders how able they are to impact the humanity of other people.
Yes.
um, and so
That's a
that's an interesting space as well.
Yes, that just came to me right now. That's very true. And and if I go to the practicality of mathematics and when we're thinking about when we're in kindergarten and the teacher's like, you can Lou, why don't you get up and count the number of students in class, and you go and you say 1, 2, 3. That humanity piece has to do with the touching, the feeling, the social, emotional, the interaction. Because I'm even thinking about, how do we count? We count on our hands. We're touching. There's that sense that there's the sensation of touch that has to do with humanity, and that is a big part of how we communicate with other people. And so as I think about when we think about math, and I'm not necessarily a mathematician, but I appreciate data, because that drives us with where we are and everything. Vaccine rollout, who's getting the vaccine, the census, all of that information. That's all data. That's all math. The humanity part of that is, who are these people and why do they feel disconnected? Or who are these people and why do they feel privileged? Or who are these people who are responsible for creating this opportunity to be in this particular notion or such? So there is a lot of humanity in science overall, because without it, you cannot teach kids to be advocates for themselves and their own learning.
Beautiful. And with that, I just want to pause for station control. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. You are listening to Pie Before Dinner. I am your host, Dr. Lou. Take a look at.
I love it.
So thank you. Yeah, I did.
I love it. Commercials.
Thank you, everyone. You're listening to Pie Before Dinner, talking math with Dr. Lou, talking math and science today. We are talking about science, slavery, and Black futurism with
Yeah.
Dr. Jennifer Stimpson, Albert Einstein Congressional Fellow. Thank you for our viewing audience who are viewing us from piebeforedinner.com website, as well as YouTube, as well as Facebook, a number of places on Facebook as well. We're so happy for this audience as they continue to grow the platform. Listen, do us a favor and go ahead, and if you're listening by YouTube, please just look up top and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Please, the number of subscribers really helps our program grow. If you are listening on Facebook, please go ahead and share this to your profile, or share this so that others can join in. We find that lots of people watch, particularly once the program is over. Thank you very much. So I'm back. I'm back here with Dr. Jennifer Stimpson. Dr. Stimpson, when we
Yeah.
think about science, right? When we think about its humanity and its problems with really relating its own humanity, it's not unproblematic. When we think about its impact today, we can also think about and talk about the past, right? And this is Black
Right.
History Month, and it's appropriate,
Right.
particularly the legacy of slavery.
Yes.
How have you come? You and I have talked about this, so I
Yes.
want to open this up. How have you come to see and understand the role of science making for the Black community? How has this shown up in the past
Oh,
that we should be mindful of to navigate ourselves moving into the present and the future?
right. So I want to start off by saying that people like Isaac Newton would not have data if it was not for slavery. And I say that because
Wow.
if we think about Isaac Newton, he was British, English, and all of that. So at the time of slavery, back in the 1600s, the idea of how to collect data was really raw. It was like, how do we, what is that? What's happening? What do we do? How can we get new information? So as many stories go, they always center and begin in Europe. And we already know that that's not really true, but we center our conversations in Europe, unfortunately. But with this story, and what I'm saying is, with data, what was happening is that the British had the best ships to take slaves from Africa and then taking them to either South America or North America. And so what was happening is that these scientists were getting on slave ships and going to these vast remote areas to collect data, because the only way you could get around the world was on a slave ship, because not many things were happening during the 1700s in terms of world travel unless they were looking for ports of entry. And so, yeah, we have Sir Drake, who went around the Horn of Africa, but he was actually going to India because he was looking for a port, and and he was looking for a place to have a new repository of people. But people don't know that story. They know superficial stuff like, Sir Alec, what's his name? Andy Drake. I can't remember his name, but I think people know what I'm talking about. But the idea of having slavery as the source of natural science, the data that was collected, that information came back to many British and European museums, and that information was told through those stories. So they would go across the slave ships and go across to Africa and South America, and all of the European areas would collect information. And then when they came back, they would have data. They would have stories to tell. And so there's the dark past of slavery that tells that what happened in the past wasn't always about us. It was about them, the idea of these British and these Europeans using the opportunity and the manufacturing of the ships to collect data. Now, in terms of Blacks being and Africans and being enslaved, well, we all know that often they were the experimental pieces to many of these curiosity doctors and adventurers. They use Black bodies as experimentations. And far too often, the modern medicine practices that are still occurring today began back in the 16 and 1700s. I mean, I recently watched a documentary that talked about the women of modern gynecology, and many of the modern gynecological practices are still being used today that Dr. Sims created back in the 1850s, that he perfected on 3 Black women. So I give a shout out to Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy, because their bodies were used so that me as a woman could have a great life and in terms of great gynecological health, and all the other women as well, because of the practices that he perfected on them. And so
I want 1 second, Doc. I want
yeah,
to pause because I think you've just touched
I can
on.
barely hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? How's that? Is that better?
A little bit better, yeah. Much better than
Okay.
before.
All right, good. I want to pause on that because I think you've hit on something that we have to really give deference to, and that is the toll on Black bodies that the science community has benefited from. Right? It's the science community. What you're saying is that the science community has benefited from Black bodies, and
Right.
I think people don't understand this, and I really don't actually like how it's being confronted in the media. The media act like, well, Black folk are paranoid, and we're just got to take this vaccine, right? But
hmm
and yeah, we've done a poor job in history, but no, do you understand that we've done a poor job for the last 2, 3, 400 years with
Right.
with experimenting with Black bodies, with science and STEM, and that's harm. That's a form of violence. So we've used science and mathematics and STEM as a form of violence. I was just reading something. I meant to send this to you actually. I was reading something
Okay.
on Facebook of a gentleman. There's a museum. I think it was in Baltimore, is in Maryland.
hmm
A museum that had bones of a slave. There was a slave that was working for his master down at the dock, and he had slipped and broke his neck and died. And
And he
the master cut his body up, dissected his body there and then,
hmm
took it home, boiled
boiled the skin off
bone,
and kept his bones.
kept his bones, and those
hmm
bones were part of the museum for uh, decades. In fact, he used his bones to teach his son, his grandsons, and there was a legacy of being taught.
Yeah.
What's the bone science? There
Osteo
was a
it's
legacy.
osteopathy, I think.
Yes, osteopathy. And so
Yes.
there was a legacy, a generational legacy of knowledge building on the
Yes.
backs of, literally on the bones of a slave, of an enslaved
Of an enslaved, right.
African.
hmm
And today in 1970 it was discontinued, and I think he got his proper burial in 2013.
He sure
So
did. Yes.
all this time, and so that's we see these are there are examples that aren't even written in history
No.
around the experimentation, exploitation
I
of
like that.
black
It's
people.
exploitation. It's mostly exploitation. It's like it's a convenience because it's we're discarded, and scientific racism began because the interpretation of who we are and what they thought we were, and we were
Yeah,
different. I
yeah,
mean, I
yeah,
bleed the same as many of my other white brothers and sisters, but that whole idea, their blood is thicker, their head is smaller, their brains are. I mean, I wonder what was going on when civilization began in Africa and emerged through all the other parts of the world, because there's a whole nother conversation we need to have about Homo naledi and Homo erectus, and how those are two very different individuals, and how certain groups of people descend from Neanderthals and certain groups of people do not, and that Neanderthal blood really creates a continuously violent perpetuation of
yeah,
who people are. That's a whole nother conversation about science.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's you're right, and but it shows, and let's pause there for a second. I want to continue this, but I just want to pause because the implications of what you're saying are real. And in fact, it's so amazing to me that this conversation is similar to some conversations I have in mathematics.
Yeah.
But with the same group of teachers I was talking to, they were asking, well, what's the big impediment? And I said, one of the big impediments to teaching mathematics equitably is we have faulty viewpoints. We have faulty beliefs about Black people. So the
Oh,
idea that Black people are not not capable of creating mathematical knowledge, for example, in some way, shape, or form, is embedded in knowledge making. Hence their perspective are excluded, right?
oh my God. Well,
Excluded in how
hello.
we do research and everything. Yeah.
But I guess they don't. People don't tell the story that the
No.
Greeks went to Timbuktu to learn. Hello. So that doesn't. That's never told. They burned. When the what is it? The Library of Alexandria burned down. The Greeks were all upset because all of their. It was almost like they got mad because their homework was burned, and so
Mhm.
this these stories can no longer center in the 1600s and modern century
Yeah.
when all of this was happening. There was science fluency before Christ,
Mhm.
but those
Mhm.
stories aren't told because we look at religion, and I don't want to even break down the scientific word of religion. Re means to keep doing, legion means to fight, so we keep fighting over and over and over again to get control of something. So the science that's perpetuated has to do with this continuous fighting over and over and over again to have control over knowledge.
And the point to make here is that it's a weaponization of science
uh,
right now. It's a weaponization,
Absolutely.
right? And and for teachers, and I don't want to lose this point, and I want to ask your just as a follow up, what's your opinion about this? I don't think teachers do our children justice, and they shouldn't enter the classroom of science and math teaching and STEM teaching without the propensity to unweaponize the very subject they teach. It's already weaponized, right?
Hmm.
It's already a loaded gun, and so you're gonna have to disarm the gun, unweaponize it, so that it can be used responsively, relevant ways, and responsibly for our children and for our generations. I think that's a message to teachers. Do you see
Hmm.
any other similar messages to teachers of science when it comes to Black bodies and Black people and the legacies?
Well, I think the beautiful part about what's about to happen, and what I mean is the great pause, this pandemic has created a great opportunity for us as educators to recalibrate. So this time, what happened in the past can no longer happen. And I have to quote Madam First Lady, past First Lady Michelle Obama, when she says, "Do not reach for normal, reach for better." I was listening to her podcast not too long ago. And in this idea of reaching for better, that is the great opportunity for educators to repurpose and retool the curriculum so that it does include truth, authenticity, and advocacy. And you mentioned, how can science be truthful to history as well as being inclusive with tactics and practices and such, and that has to do with how the curriculum is written. And that means that you need to have a disruptive approach to curriculum writing. And so that might be at the district level. If you're in certain school districts, you might have that control at the school site level. But I think that the curricula will forever have to change. And I think that now is the great time to change that. So in terms of teachers having a responsibility to teach authenticity, I think that they do, that many of them do give their best, but I think that there needs to be a responsibility so that there is equity in teaching. So if you're a white person trying to teach about Black bodies, the knowledge that you have, you're going to have to go above and beyond to neutralize your opinions and your feelings and your disruption and your uncomfortableness to teach the truth. Because far too often when you're a student of color, you've already been weaponized. You've already come from this legacy and this history of being uncomfortable and being in the space of feeling fear. And then you're put in front of a teacher who doesn't look like you, who doesn't identify with you, who has an entirely different perspective than you. And so you feel like, so I've got to, firm up. But one of the things that I think that teachers can take, one of the actions I think teachers can take is being responsible with what and how they teach. How are they teaching advocacy, and not just saying, oh, today we're going to learn about George Washington Carver, but learning how to, well, I mean, that's like the plain vanilla. If you don't get any more plain vanilla than that, I mean, rest in peace, Dr. Carver. But that there's so many other things to talk about and to teach. But when you're teaching about science, we have to be responsible and know how to include the entirety and the truth of it, and knowing that history, knowing the background of it.
George Washington Carver must be so tired by the time this Black History.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I mean, he looks at the post too. I mean, are there no other scientists that have done anything since he's been around and his peanuts? Is there nobody else doing nothing? I mean, I laugh because everybody knows that. I have a little cousin who was born during the pandemic, and I don't want her to only be able to call George Washington Carver. There has to be other scientists that we can start name dropping. You know what I mean?
Yeah, listen. I have and I'll save that point. I think what you're saying to us, teachers, we have to challenge what we're teaching. We have to really
Yes.
challenge what we're teaching, and this is an opportunity for us to do this during Black History Month. I want to shift gears just to something you said just a moment ago. We one of my pet peeves is how we automatically think when we think of these celebrations of Black History Month, we keep up an elite system, and we just think of, well, what scientist can I recognize, what mathematician can I recognize, when science, all of us are science makers, all of us are science doers, right? And sciences can be in the hands of ordinary folk. And so we ought to think about how science was practiced, how math has been practiced with ordinary people. And I'm going to give you an example.
I'm listening. I got you too.
When I was growing up, my granny said, "Look, you have a cold, you're sick. Go outside and pick you some match me. What are these called? Match me if you can leaves. Some weird kind of leaves that turn greenish and purplish in my in Bermuda, and let's go boil those up and have some herb tea. That's how I learned about herb tea.
Right.
Now tea bags, all these funny kind of tea bags and stuff. But I learned it from the wisdom of Granny, who didn't have a high school education, but that was passed on to her. When we got scrapes and bruises, I learned about, listen, go cut this thing, little green thing, look like a cactus, aloe, right?
Yeah.
Go cut
Yeah.
that thing, and just let's go put it on what we call in Bermuda road rash or a rash.
Yeah.
I have some road rash here. And put that on that, and sometimes we'd have to drink it and put it in everything and tea and drink it. And I
Yeah.
learned about that scientific wisdom not from the established academy, and that's
Right.
great. But I learned the wisdom that was passed down, and too often we overlook that. What do you think about that? What's the role of when Black communities think about science and how we've contributed to scientific knowledge? What's the role of our own stories in this?
Wow. I think that's also overlooked. Like your grandmother, my mother gave me some Vicks. I had asthma growing up, and I would rub Vicks on my chest and under my nose and on my feet, and I'd go to bed. And every Black person listening, when you get sick, you have a cough, or if you fall down, break your leg, you get you some ginger ale or some Sprite and some crackers and go lay down and take a 30-minute nap. Everybody knows that. So y'all, shout out to B, y'all know that. But this, I also laugh because it's not, well, I laugh because I think about like my grandmother, who, like yours, didn't have a high school education, didn't go to school. She probably only went to the doctor 3 or 4 times in her life because, her children said, you got to go to the doctor, you got to go to the doctor. But so many of them learned their healing from their ancestors who also didn't go to the doctor. There was there was very few doctors that cared for the poor and the elderly and the Blacks. Back then they were Negroes. So my parents were Negroes growing up. So they didn't take care of the Negroes and the colored folks. So they had to create their own, and they knew who to go to. And on the plantation, it was the Negro doctor or the medicine man. And they learned how to create those, using whatever tactics that were there, the practice that were there, and they brought those in. And so what science stories, come from my old days, what science story do I have, that carries my wisdom from my dad and my mom? My parents were both pharmacists, so I lucked up and always had access to medicine because my dad owned his own pharmacy and my mom was also a pharmacist. And so what I learned from them is that when you know how to help someone, you take care of them. So I actually didn't learn science per se from my dad. I learned civic engagement and community responsibility from him. And so
is that not science? Is that not a part? Depends. You're getting into some serious stuff.
Pharmacist, he was old school. So my dad, when you came in and had your prescription to him, he would literally go and get the different the different liquids and chemicals and create your cough syrup. He actually pressed pills. Raise your hand out there if you have been to a compounding pharmacy and seen a pill presser. Exactly. All 7 of y'all. The idea of seeing that, so I got to see community service and public engagement, and to make sure that people who were underserved had access to adequate healthcare. And so my dad taught me how to do that. He had his own delivery service. He'd go out to the poor people and these people who didn't have science literacy or medical fluency. So the wisdom I learned from him is to those who are less fortunate than you also need help support. And so if you can teach them that, then you should do that.
Now see, for me, what you're describing to me is what I envision for mathematics, right? That's what I call, I don't see a distinction. I call that science. I call that mathematics. It's the mathematics of humanity, that it's about civic engagement, right? It's relating to humanity is a mathematical thing, is a scientific thing. We haven't been taught that, but so when you say your father, I think your father taught you about he was maybe ahead of his time because he was teaching you about a humanized vision of science for the future. And so since we're at it, let's go to that. So we have about 10 minutes left. Let's go directly to that. You and I have talked about this behind the scenes, and I was intrigued by your use of the word Afrofuturism. I said Black futurism, but Afrofuturism.
Afrofuturism.
How does that play in the role of science? How do you see the role of science in Afrofuturism? And just explain that for us, working together.
Well, I think Afrofuturism is just Black people taking control and being the people and the leaders and the creativity. We are already a creative people. There would be, people are like, they love Black people, but they don't like Black culture. If you take Black culture away from the society, what do we have? Our presence and our creativity and our influence, our innovation is everywhere. And so Afrofuturism to me means we are at the helm of creating our own spaces for the betterment of society. So one thing about there's what the movie that came out, of course, is Black Panther. When that came out, everybody loved that movie. They got to see T'Challa, doing his thing. He was a physics genius. That was never covered in the movie, but we gave a shout out to his sister Zuri, and she's a scientist, so we got to see a sister at the helm, normalizing what it means to see Black people in professional STEM spaces. So I'm a Black science teacher, and I work in a space where there's not many teachers who look like me, but I am a professional science professional. I used to work as a professional scientist, but far too often there's not enough of people who look like me, either Black women or women in general, or just Black people. So Afrofuturism is this whole idea of taking creative control to normalize presence of Black people in these science spaces, not just to have a voice, not just to have a narrative, not just to have a seat at the table, but to have control over that. I mean, I'm super excited about Master P and his new car. I hope he calls me and asks me to be on his team, and I'm gonna bring 4 or 5 of my friends to come along with me. And normalizing that. So, I love what he says. He's like, there's these new apps that pop up every day. And he asked, like, when are we going to create our own? Again, normalizing our presence and our creativity. We are a creative people. And this futuristic idea is creating data sciences, having a data space, being present in cybersecurity as we move forward, having a place in aerospace engineering and aerospace technology. I have a friend right here, right now. He's probably at home. If he's listening, he's probably coding this conversation right now, and he's written an entirely new strand of code that's probably communicating with outer worlds right now. And I'm like, people are geniuses, but we're not often given that opportunity to tout that. So this creativity piece. So Afrofuturism is using those creative genes to take a lead to change the platform of the world.
I want to hold space for that real quick, because I think, I've been using Clubhouse lately as a platform. I've been on the platform and I've bumped into so many hundreds of Black STEM professionals, scientists, engineers, mathematics creators, and mathematicians and teachers and the like. And I have been blown away, because 20 years ago, and I was 4 or 5, 20 years ago.
I wasn't even born. What are you talking about?
These spaces did not exist. I did not see these. You didn't have access to these networks. And so we're in a renaissance of Black creative thought in math and science, from hidden thing. This is the renaissance of unhidden figures, right?
Yes,
the renaissance of Wakanda, the renaissance of the Black Panther. That's the space we're in. And I think what you said,
Black Panther. But I'm going to ask a question for the community out there. But is Wakanda Afrofuturism, or is it Africa Uninterrupted? Because a lot of people think it's Afrofuturism because it's new and it's hip and it's cool, but it could be Africa Uninterrupted. We make the assumption that it was influenced by Western culture, but what if it really was existing as it is and it was already there uninterrupted? That's the beautiful part for me. That's that humanity piece, that they didn't need an outside force to influence its greatness. So, but part of Afrofuturism, this idea of STEM futurism for Black people, is why don't we redefine the letters of STEM that matter to us? So my call to action to everyone listening is, let's have this conversation about repurposing the S, the T, the E, and the M. And if you have an answer or a vision, or if you have an advocacy for that, let's do that.
Wow. Now why would you wait to the end of this show to drop that gem on us?
Because it's time. It is time. And we said that. So Lou, we might have more work to do with this. I'm going to need you to pass the mic to let somebody else do your pie before dinner, because you're going to step up your game and you're going to have to get some cake now. Because
no, I hear you. I accept the challenge. Get some cake now.
we passed.
Hey, listen, one of the things you are saying that I've been a proponent of, and I do not hear this being preached in Black communities like I want to, and you're preaching it right now. We are creators of science. We're still chasing science. We're still following behind. Here's science. I need you to be interested in science. But no, I need you to understand that you are a science creator. And if
Yes.
you enter into the picture, then the whole the very nature of science is going to change
The
because
very
you enter
nature of it.
the
Yes.
very nature. We've proven it. Everything we
Yes.
enter into as a community has to change.
See, Lou, you
Right?
just have to think about it like I think about it. I cause a revolution every time I walk into a room. Just by existing, I want to create that disruption. You know, I don't want to just be
Yes,
like, oh,
yes.
is Jennifer here? When I walk in, I need everybody to figure out how they're going to step up their game when it comes to science education, because they are not. Because that's how disruptive we need this future perspective to
This is
be.
true. I like that. Afrofuturism, a version of Africa Interrupted, and Africa Disruption. This
Yes,
disruption of science, disruption. So because science, as it is currently constituted, has to be disrupted,
has to
and
be
that's
right.
exciting. That is
Right.
exciting. I love that, Jennifer. I'm looking so forward to working with you in the future. I see great things for us and for our communities. I love your vision. Thank you for talking with us about science, slavery, and Afrofuturism. I have
Yeah.
any parting words for our guests and our audience?
I want you to do what it takes, not what's easiest. Always do that. When you live in that space, you can rise up and keep going. Always
Wow.
give up, never, always give out, never give up.
Wow, I love that. Thank you very much. Jennifer, thank you very much. You have been listening to Pie Before Dinner. I am your host, Dr. Lou, talking after Dr. Lou with my special guest, Dr. Jennifer Stimpson, the Albert
Uh-huh.
Einstein Congressional Fellow. Thank you very much. Next week, we're going to have another exciting show during this week of this series. This is our 29th episode. So, ladies and gentlemen, if this is your first time with Pie Before Dinner, know that we have on our site, piebeforedinner.com, you can see all of the exciting episodes. But we're going to continue this work. But we have a very strong lineup in particular for Black History Month. Thank you
Right.
very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer. Take care and see you again here next week.